My name is James McGrath. For those of you who don't know me, I am a professor of religious studies here. My main field is early Christianity, New Testament, things related to that. Some of you will know I also do things on science fiction and that kind of stuff. A number of my research interests came together over the course of the last year, which I spent on sabbatical. And so I've got some photos here. Some of you may have seen at least a couple of them on Facebook if you are Facebook friends with me. But I knew it wasn't good to just be my Facebook friends here. And even with those connections, Facebook's algorithm hides stuff from us nowadays. But I also thought that if it turns out that what I say about John the Baptist is unpersuasive, uninteresting, offensive, a combination thereof, at the very least I can talk about what I did during my sabbatical and how I sort of made it happen and managed to pull off for the first time, and hopefully not the last, having done it, a year-long sabbatical. And I know that earlier in my academic career, I would not have had the information and the connections to know how to make something like that happen. And so, if nothing else, hopefully that will be useful. And a few of the pictures might encourage you to go to some places. But John the Baptist apparently gathers a crowd. And we're going to see that that was true historically as well. I have some colleagues from the humanities here, and you at least will know that the question posed in the title is not going to get a straightforward, simple yes or no answer. And it wouldn't have been worth your time coming if that had been the case anyway. But who gets to decide who's the most important figure in the history of religion? And I'm pretty sure there's some people here today who would like to say, yeah, I'd like to propose a different nominee, right? But John the Baptist certainly is a figure that influenced a lot of the figures, directly and indirectly, that you probably think of more readily as the most important figure, or the most famous figure, or the most influential figure in the history of religion. So what did I do during my year-long sabbatical? And I will save the story of how I ended up working on this a little bit until later when I talk about some of the things that connect with that directly. But as somebody who does New Testament, doesn't probably need too much explanation. One of the places I've liked to travel in the past, and until just very recently was telling my students that I would take them to in the near future, is the Holy Land. Yep. And so, happening anymore. Just the summer before last, I took a trip. First time doing this on my own, renting a car, not working with a guide or doing. I had been without a guide, but had never driven myself in the Holy Land, and went to places connected with John the Baptist, both recently, right? So this is a place called Yardenit, and when, for those of you who've either been to the Holy Land or know a little bit about it, when the historic site of Jesus' baptism, which may or may not be the real historical thing, but the traditional one, was closed because of the conflict between Israel and Jordan, a kibbutz near the Sea of Galilee said, why don't we just open another one? And I visited this place, partly because it's lovely, but also because it's in Galilee, and John seems to have had a lot of followers from Galilee, and so there may have been some activity here. But also struck by the fact that people will go to a place that has obviously no actual historical connection with John the Baptist, but it has a connection with the Jordan River, you can associate with the stories, you can put yourself in the story, and will go there, and even if they've been baptized before, and they're some sort of Christian where you only get baptized once in that tradition, will put themselves in the water again. And so there's something about this story that is continues to be meaningful for people. This is the traditional site, and you have Jordan, literally, right, on one side of the Jordan River, the country of Jordan, and Israel on the other. And so you can see why, at the height of tensions, this was not going to be open to the public, right? And now they just have people with machine guns on either side, just making sure that nobody dips under on one side and comes out from their baptism on the other and carries on walking. There's also a fascinating place that I'd never been, went to lots of places out in the middle of nowhere, got off the highway, got on these winding roads. My wife was with me on this trip, and she won't mind me telling you that there were moments, usually about halfway between getting off the highway onto a windy road and reaching our destination, when she'd say, are you sure about this? But some of these out-of-the-way places are fascinating, and I wanted to show pictures of places like this. This is known as the Monastery of St. John in the Wilderness. And if you look at the flowers and what's growing there, you'll see that wilderness, in this case, doesn't mean desert. Right? And I think that's going to be an important point. So even though the text will sometimes translate it as desert, it really does mean a place away from urban centers. Right? And one of the places I stopped when I was trying to find that place, and I was so happy I did because I could tell the story, was a place called the Essene Farm. It's a naturist thing, has nothing to do with the historical Essenes, but for those few of you who know that there have been suggestions that John the Baptist had a historical connection with this group known as the Essenes, the ones that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. The fact that when I was looking for John the Baptist in the wilderness, I stopped to ask directions at the Essene Farm. I love that. I will keep telling that story. And so did go to Qumran, the place where the Dead Sea Scrolls are found, but also went to some other places that there's no way to get there other than renting a car and going there. And Tel Shalem is probably the place, Salim, and it says that John was active at a place called Enon near Salim, the springs near Salim, because there was much water there. And there's a kibbutz right by there that's fed by those springs, and they have more than a mile of fish ponds. Now, there weren't fish ponds in John's day, but the fact that you can fill fish ponds with the water that flows there, I was like, whoo, I had no idea. It says there's much water there, you read that in the text, did not give me this impression, right? And going to this kibbutz and going to this part of the world and visiting it really was helpful. It gave me a lot of stories to tell. So I spent the last year writing 2 books. One is an academic, detailed study about John the Baptist, but one is a general audience biography. And in the biography, I'll tell some of the stories. But really getting the chance to see that John's wilderness, right, was not the desert. It was not him getting away from everyone. It was him getting to the crossroads, right, where he could encounter people. And in particular, people making their way from elsewhere to Jerusalem. So on that kibbutz, and I can tell you some stories about the kibbutz. By the way, I have a lot more slides that I'm planning to get through, and sometimes I will flip through them quickly. It's not because, even after so many years of teaching, I still don't know how to prepare the right number of slides. It's because I'm expecting to speak briefly about some things and come back and share more if there is interest. Or stop if somebody shouts out and says, hey, wait, please say more about that. You are, in fact, free to do so if you'd like. Wandering around that kibbutz where I was staying, it was as close to the Jordan River in that part of the country as I could get. Walking around, you see these things, and you stop and look and puzzle out what they are, and eventually realize they're Roman mile markers from the century after John. And while the Romans sometimes built very straight roads where there weren't very straight roads before, they built roads where people traveled, right? And so it's clear that this place that now is in the middle of nowhere was a major thoroughfare, right? As people made their way, following the course of the river from Galilee to Jerusalem. And nearby, they found the only, I think there's maybe one other similarly complete bronze bust of Hadrian that was found nearby. So there was a Roman encampment there. And then a city known as Beth Shan, which was the capital of the Decapolis, right? So it's also known as Scythopolis. Had a theater, had all these things. And this was, about 3 kilometers from Tel Shalem. And so where John was active was, not in American terms, but in ancient terms and some modern European terms, walking distance from one of the major cities in the region. Right? So I had a chance to go there. And it doesn't look now like it did then, hopefully it goes without saying, but you can get a sense of just what a major city this was. Right? And so this is important because what I'm going to move on to now is reflecting on some of the assumptions and some of the popular portraits we have of John and why I think some of them need to be rethought seriously. So when you think of John the Baptist, is that kind of the impression you get? How many of you have actually seen that, that particular rendition, right? His hair gets more and more wild all the time, and that might be the one thing that maybe they're getting right. We'll come back to that. But for many of you, maybe, and for probably most people today, if they're interested in John the Baptist, it's because of his association with Jesus, because that's how they know about him. And most historians will tell you that at least while John was still alive and active, John was the one who was really more famous. And that changes so much over time that it's almost unimaginable now, right? And so I tried to spend this year trying to get a glimpse of John as a figure in his own right? Because even if the relationship with Jesus is an important one for understanding John correctly is important for understanding Jesus. So let's think about some of these cultural images and stereotypes, right? It's there in some older art, right? A lot of it's based around clothes with camel hair, and of course eating locusts, not that uncommon in this part of the world, right? Not a big deal, but a lot of the depictions, am I right? Looks like a caveman. Looks like it's not dressed in clothing made of camel hair. It looks like he wrestled a camel with his bare hands, tore off its hide, threw it casually around himself, and then started baptizing people. Right? And AI confirms that this is a stereotype because I was doing a search for images to include in a PowerPoint, and it gave me lots of images from TV and movie, and one from 1 million years BC, which Google thought must be the same guy, same kind of thing. So it is the impression that we've been given, right? But it's clothing made from camel hair, right? And now I'm not suggesting that he dressed like this, right? But you can still get camel hair suits. And in dressing in clothing made out of camel hair, right, he was echoing the stories about Elijah, right? And most interpreters down the ages have perceived that, have mentioned it. If you look at some classic artistic depictions, it's like, I would love to have something like that out of camel hair. That looks pretty nice, right? It is not that he may be wearing rougher garments, he may be, but he is not shabbily dressed, and he's not somebody who looks like some homeless person who's eating bugs and who most people are keeping away from. Not only does he attract people like Jesus of Nazareth, who many people think had good taste in people, although 1 out of 12 anyway, never mind. But he also had followers as far afield as places like Ephesus in Asia Minor, Alexandria, and we find out about this from the book of Acts. And so this is a figure that many people took seriously, and our depictions of him don't convey that. Right? And so trying to situate him in the context of the Herodian Tetrarchy, so Herod the Great, right, was the father of Herod Antipas, and Herod Antipas got a quarter of his father's kingdom, not literally, geographically a quarter, but one of 4 pieces of it that were divided up among Herod the Great's children. And 3 times Herod Antipas petitioned different emperors asking to be appointed as king. And so this is this figure that eventually kills John the Baptist, right? And so looking at him gives us some context as well. And John moved between Antipas's territory and the territory that was initially ruled by Archelaus and then went under direct Roman rule, which included Judah or Judea and Samaria. And one of the other things that I did on this trip that I'd never done before was to visit the Samaritans. Most people have heard of the Samaritans. They know there was at least one good one, and it's actually a really terrible phrase, right? Because it's the kind of thing people say when they have bigotries today. It's like one of the good ones, it's like terrible. But what a lot of people don't know is that they're still around. There's about 500 of them, so this is like a really endangered community. But the remnants of the northern Israelite tribes are still there. They do have a museum, and managed to get as my tour guide. I thought he was probably going to be a good choice initially, and then I realized that he's actually the grandson of the Samaritan high priest, and I was like, okay, that's perfect. And so he actually took us to his grandfather's home and introduced us, and I had the Aaronic priestly blessing pronounced on me by what may be a descendant of the ancient Israelite high priest. So whether he's the rightful one that should have been on, I don't know, but he was completely wrong. Even if you don't buy that at all, it was still a very cool experience. And so got to visit the well that's also, for those of you who know, I wrote a book, What Jesus Learned from Women, and has the Samaritan woman and Jesus on the cover, and so got to visit that site that's supposedly where the well is, and gave the tour guide a copy of the book because it got it on the cover. And visited this place, which is supposed to be the tomb of John the Baptist in Samaria. And for those of you who don't know this, if you visit the Holy Land, you will be taken to all kinds of sites and told this is what happened here, and 9 times out of 10, your response should be, yeah, right, how do you know that? Right? But it's still fascinating that John is associated with Samaria so much, right, and perceived as having such an impact in us there and such an association with it, that tradition would say his tomb was there, right? I mean, that in itself tells us something. This is a terrible photo. I'm squinting because the sun was in my eyes, so I'll cover it up with a different one. This is me coming out of Church of John the Baptist in Jerusalem, which is also fascinating. But went around the Holy Land trying to get a sense of this place, because things like the wilderness are things that we're likely to understand incorrectly, or at least not get quite right unless we visit them. And of course also went to Tiberias, which was Herod Antipas's capital. Nobody visits this part of the world interested in seeing places associated with Herod Antipas. And so the guy who killed John the Baptist, if anybody's interested in him, it's because of John the Baptist, Jesus. So that I thought was interesting in and of itself. So that was last summer, not this past summer, but the summer before that. And then during the fall semester, I got to go to Magdalen College, mostly because I wanted an excuse to dress like this. For those of you who know me well enough to know that I never dress like that. Yes, I did take what bits I could from my son's old band uniform and try to repurpose them. It was very cool dining in a place like this. But I want to mention this, right? So the trip to the Holy Land was funded with a back grant. And so if you are relatively new faculty, there are internal grants that you can get for some research and travel funds and things like that. If you have a sabbatical and are just taking a semester, and so all it would take to make it possible for you to visit some other part of the world is room and board, there are lots of colleges in the UK that have those kinds of fellowships where they have room and board, and so all you need is the time off work, which Butler gives us regularly if we're on the tenure track. And so you may not hear about those through any means that circulate very regularly in the United States. I will happily share more about that for those who are interested, but just want to encourage you, if that's something you're interested in doing, to explore it. I had a good reason to go to Oxford. I knew I needed a year-long sabbatical, not just because of the research project, but because I was exhausted after teaching through COVID. And this did definitely help me recharge. But I applied for anything and everything in the hope of making that possible. And some of them might have had me for a year in Wisconsin. And I have nothing against Wisconsin, but it doesn't have the connections with John the Baptist that some of the other places I got to did. And so piecing together little bits here and there actually worked out better. So why Oxford? Other than, wow, it's Oxford. It was so that I could actually go, and yes, I did use the card catalog in one of the reading rooms. There are some important manuscripts there associated with a group that some of you will know that I have done work on, and which I will introduce briefly for those who may not be familiar with them, known as the Mandaeans. And so if you want to consult manuscripts, right, the book catalogs are mostly digitized and accessible online. If you want to access manuscripts, you still pretty much need to go into the card catalog and then ask for things, and they see if they can find them, and they pretty consistently did. So for those of you who haven't heard me talk about the Mandaeans before, who here has never heard of the Mandaeans before? I'm guessing that's probably some of you. Has everyone here heard of Gnostics, Gnosticism? At least vaguely. Most people have, right? It's an ancient religious tradition. It's been shown some interest in the modern era. And a lot of people don't know that one Gnostic group from ancient times has survived down to the present day. And that's the Mandaeans. And among ancient Gnostic groups and ancient Gnostic traditions, they stand out because they view John the Baptist as a central figure, as a prophet in their tradition. They view themselves as followers of him. They're not such big fans of Jesus. And that's a pretty unique religious configuration, but it's been suggested from time to time that they might have some historic connection with followers of John the Baptist that didn't become Christians. Right? And so the potential for their sources to have some relevance to the historical John the Baptist is a real one. And so you may have seen me share some of these things before, visiting with Mandaeans. They have fascinating illustrated scrolls. I am going to move very quickly through some of these, but I was able to give a talk at the Bodleian Libraries and have some of the manuscripts on display. For those of you who know that I did a translation project of the Mandaean Book of John, I worked with digital copies when I was working on that, but actually got to see the manuscript this time, and so see it in person and have it there on display, which was very cool. And obviously, you could just spend, we could spend an hour and just talk about these manuscripts that are fascinating. So The Mandaean Book of John translation, right, the text itself is online, so you can, it was an NIH grant that funded that. There's an open access translation, so if you want to browse it, you can Google Mandaean Book of John. I will spell it again for you if you need me to, and find the PDF of that and browse it. And if you do so while I'm talking, because that seems more interesting at the moment, that's absolutely okay with me. But there's stories in it about John. There's stories about Zechariah and Elizabeth, right, and the birth of John. Things that have connections with and yet are interestingly different from the versions we find in the New Testament. Right? And so I will not spend time retelling these stories. Just wanted to emphasize that another facet of this research project was trying to bring these sources into the picture. Because there was a time when New Testament scholars paid a lot of attention to these and tried to plug them in as New Testament background. And then there was an appropriate backlash saying, yeah, these sources are later, you can't just plug them as background like that. But it swung to the other extreme, and some people said, well, maybe they just borrowed John during the Islamic era, and that doesn't fit the evidence either. And so there's really a need to revisit them. And when I was working on this translation project, I knew that both because that was really what got me interested in them in the first place, but also because if anyone's going to pay attention to these sources again, I need to do this, need to bring this back around, connect it with my New Testament work, and do some work on what do these sources tell us about John. The book of John, just briefly, and I'll come back to any of these points you want me to later, but has a parable about a good shepherd, right? Has all kinds of stuff with ethical teaching that very similar to what you get about John the Baptist and Jesus in the New Testament, things to do with sexual morality and things like that, but a lot about economic and social justice. Right? And then there are warnings about this being bad news for the temple. And that's something I am going to spend a bit more time on in just a few minutes. John was proclaiming baptism for the forgiveness of sins. And that sounds like what animal sacrifice was supposed to do. Right? And so they also have their own version of Jesus coming to John to be baptized, and John not wanting to because he thinks that Jesus is bad news. Very, very different portrait than the one you're familiar with if you're familiar with the New Testament version. And could say more about that. But let me breeze through and say that I think maybe the most interesting object I held in my hands during this, and got to actually touch during this sabbatical, and maybe ever in my academic career, was this magical scroll, and it's like written on both sides. It has Arabic, it has a fake script, it has Mandaic stuff, which is a dialect of Aramaic. It has these diagrams, and a lot of it is just like hocus pocus stuff that you get in magical scrolls and other traditions too. But unrolling this and realizing that it's written on both sides, and then it has these different scripts, including some made-up ones, and has these diagrams for how to drive out demons, and things to do with exorcism, which we're also get stories about in early Christian sources. And so just wanted to share some of these pictures. This particular scroll was not at all relevant to this particular project, and as soon as I got a look at it, I was like, I'm taking pictures and I'm going to come back to this sometime. So one of the great things about having a year-long sabbatical is that you might actually have time to do that. And so I think you'll agree with me that these things are really weird and truly fascinating. Right? Looked at other old texts, and so got to look at some things in what should have been a much more comfortable language for me as a New Testament person, Greek, except that Greek handwriting changed over time, and during the Middle Ages they did all these kinds of squiggles to join letters together, and I was looking at this feeling really bad about my scholarly abilities until I realized that when I get Christmas cards from people who are writing to me in my own language, I have to stare at them for a while before I can actually make sense of them. And then I felt a little better and stared at it for a while, and it actually started to make a bit more sense. But there were books that couldn't even open all the way, right? And which probably nobody has actually opened for quite some time. But that's enough of that. Now it's getting close to Christmas, and so I thought I would say a little bit about John and the Nativity, because one of the things I thought was a major discovery over this project was that these stories about John's childhood, right? And for those of you who don't know, historians look at like miraculous infancy stories in ancient texts and pretty much skip over them because they don't expect to find much that's useful there. but sometimes they include details, right? Names of Jesus' parents, the place that he was from, things like that. And it seems like the same might be true of the John the Baptist story. And that story does give us an indication of John's importance in this time. Right? You start reading the Gospel of Luke as a Christian, you might be caught off guard. It says, many have undertaken to write an account of these important events that happened in this time, and then he says, there was this priest named Zechariah. Right? So it's the story of John the Baptist. That's where it starts. And so Zechariah is the priest, right? John the Baptist, as far as we know, didn't practice that profession, but it goes deeper than that. He proclaims baptism for the forgiveness of sins, right? And so that sounds kind of like he might be, imagine a son that is setting up a competing franchise to his father's business, trying to put them out of business. I was like, oh my gosh, there's got to be an interesting family backstory to that. I wish I could figure out what it is, but I probably can't. But if you know me, I don't leave things at that. I kept thinking about it. And so, hoping that a particular individual would be here. Priests in ancient Judaism, right, just to be clear, it's more this and less that. Sorry, but had to do that. But yeah, somebody who offered animal sacrifice for the sake of forgiveness. This happened in the temple in Jerusalem. And that was the only place, according to Jewish law, that you could offer sacrifice. Right? And John offering forgiveness elsewhere, part of it is a commentary on this locking up of forgiveness in particular places. Right? And so when Jesus talked about living water, as the Mandaean tradition also does, and saying that there's going to be worship that doesn't require it to be either in Jerusalem or on Mount Gerizim, the Samaritan sacred site, I think he was reflecting the influence of John the Baptist on him. Right? And so another facet of this project was realizing that most of the times we breeze past John in our haste to get to Jesus, but in fact, because there's such a close association in the sources, Jesus can actually tell us a lot more about John than we've ever cared to ask about. Right? How do we know his baptism was something distinctive? Right? This was an era in which, first of all, Greek and Roman bathing growing in popularity. Full immersion for the sake of ritual purity, widespread, right? So these immersion pools pop up all over the land. And so in an era when more people are immersing, right, more people are baptizing themselves than ever before, how do you get the nickname John the Baptizer? Right? And so he has to be doing something that stands out even within that context. So what we get in these stories, right, we get details like you must never drink wine or strong drink. For those who know the Jewish scriptures, what Christians sometimes call the Old Testament, there are other stories in which you get the same detail, right? The story of the birth of Samuel, which you can find in the first chapter of the book of Samuel. And there's a famous poem after that, not as famous as another one that it might remind you of, in which Hannah bursts forth and says, "My heart exults in the Lord, my strength," and gives thanks after she conceives. And this seems to be an influence on the Magnificat. And in fact, in some manuscripts of the Gospel of Luke, it says, "And Elizabeth said," and then we have the Magnificat, which is really interesting. I'm not sure I don't think that was necessarily the original reading in Luke, but it might reflect an awareness that this song, this poem, seems to have a connection with the way the story of John the Baptist is told, more than the way the story of Jesus is told. And maybe there were Baptist nativity stories, not Baptist in the sense of the modern Christian denomination, just to be clear, but Baptist in the sense of John's movement, that were preserving some of these traditions. The other one is Samson and his mother, right? And so what we're told about Samuel and Samson is that they were to be lifelong Nazarites, right? Now Nazarites, that's not the same thing as Nazarenes, away from Nazareth. Nazarite normally meant somebody took a vow, and the example I use sometimes when teaching is, it's like when Phoebe says about her friend Marge playing field drums at the wedding, and Monica comments on how Marge smells. Phoebe says, she'll shower when Tibet is free, right? And so she's made a vow that she's not going to do something until such and such happens, right? And there was an official type of vow for that, known as the Nazarite vow, where you didn't consume alcoholic beverages or grape products, you didn't cut your hair until you fulfilled the vow. And Samson and Samuel are unique in being dedicated to that for life. Now what's interesting, right, it would be easy to say, well, Luke is just telling John's story through the lens, drawing on these older stories in order to make a connection with the Jewish scriptures. But people would have known whether John looked like those pictures that we saw earlier with the wild hair, and whether he did refrain from consuming alcohol. And so one of the ways that people have always read these stories, right, people who are wrestling with their own infertility, for instance, is to say, God, if you will do for me what you did for those women, then I will do with my child what they did with theirs. Right? And so we can envisage Elizabeth making a vow of that sort, right? Just as Hannah, the mother of Samuel, had. And so we have the laws about the Nazarites, and what I don't think anybody, before I did this research project, had realized is that there's a direct contradiction between what the Nazarite has to do with their hair and what priests have to do with their hair. So priests are required to keep their hair tidy. A Nazarite is prohibited from cutting their hair and keeping it tidy. And that means that if there was this vow, then John is going to be caught between this Nazarite vow and his father's lineage of priesthood. And that's going to make for some interesting things, right? We get to discuss in the Babylonian Talmud, they even discuss how often a king cuts his hair, a high priest, and common priest, and things like that. So there's a problem, right, at the heart, a dilemma at the heart of the story, right? And so John, as we see him depicted, right, people were aware that this is how Luke's gospel is saying we should understand him, but that means that he can't be a priest. And I'm betting John went to the scriptures and looked at it. It's like, okay, so it's the story of Samuel that got me into this. Let me see what this... And saw things that Samuel actually was offering sacrifices, even though he's not a priest, right? And that the stories in the scriptures are actually rather more complicated than worship in one place, forgiveness being available in one place. And so I think that this may have led to him seeking an alternative way of doing something priest-like, even though he couldn't follow in his father's footsteps and be about his father's business. And I think because at this point he might have even seen that there's this commandment, honor your father and mother, and it's like dad says be a priest, mom says vow to be a Nazarite. It's like sometimes there are tensions that run right through the middle of the commandment, right? And so realizing that there are limits and that the law can only do so much. There's a story that we find in the Gospels about Jesus driving people out of the temple, right? And that what John was saying was something that was a threat to the temple, right? Either symbolically or literally, comes across in the fact that in all the Gospels there's a connection between Jesus doing this and John the Baptist. You may have heard it called the cleansing of the temple. It probably didn't signify cleansing. It may have been signifying its destruction. My favorite way of referring to it, some of you already know, is as the temple tantrum. But that's just because I like puns. But this is actually a well-planned out symbolic action, right? He's challenged by what authority do you do this, and what does he answer according to the Gospel of Mark? I'll ask you a question, and then I'll tell you by what authority I do these things. What's John's authority? Right? And so he connects what he did with what John the Baptist had been doing. And according to the Gospel of John, Jesus did this thing in Jerusalem, in the temple, while John the Baptist was still active. And so while Jesus would have been perceived as being part of John's movement. And Josephus, I'm going to mention Josephus a few more times. Josephus, the Jewish historian from the first century, said that one of the reasons why Herod Antipas feared John was that the people seemed ready to do anything that he might advise them to. And the only thing we know of that we can really say John seems to have influenced somebody to do something that might have drawn this attention is Jesus carrying out this action in the temple. And so the possibility that Jesus' action on John's behalf as part of John's movement actually led rather directly to John being arrested and then executed may have been one of the things that led Jesus to reinterpret his own role in light of what happened to his mentor. We have some hints of a royal hope around John, which don't come from Christian sources and yet show up in Christian sources, which I can say more about. But I realize that I should be moving along. If there are any art historians here, I threw this one in just because there's a long tradition of depicting John in art that looks a lot like something that the Mandaeans do, and so talk with me about that. But think about baptism. Right? It's such a widely accepted thing as part of Christianity that how somebody would invent this thing, is something that, again, might never occur to us. Mandaean baptism is something that you can do repeatedly. They do it on major holidays, but they also do it whenever forgiveness is needed. And so it's practically, functionally, like sacrifice in that regard. And at some point, because of similarities I saw, visited South Asia and noticed that there are immersion rituals there, had thought, maybe this ritual might have transmitted itself along the Silk Road and reached John. Turns out, and asked my colleague Chad Bauman to look into this for me, and the impression we got is that it may not have reached South Asia, or at least not started to flourish there until the Middle Ages. And by that point, there are offshoots of John's religious influence that have reached South Asia. I mean, Christians among them. But also, some of you may have heard of Manichaeism, which makes it as far as China. It was the religion of St. Augustine, before he becomes a Christian. And Mani, who founded that group, started out in a Baptist group. So at one point they thought it might be the Mandaeans. It was a group known as the Elkasites, but it was a Christian group that was stood much closer to John and had repeated immersions, just like the Mandaeans did. So I won't spend a lot of time on these pictures or talking about them. What I'd say to you to do is, we live in a wonderful era. Used to be you have to go to the Middle East to see a Mandaean baptism. Now you can go on YouTube. Please do, if you've never seen one of these, because it really is fascinating. The ritual and the tradition is fascinating in all kinds of ways. So I said I'm going to try to defend the claim that John the Baptist, if not the most influential figure, at least a seriously influential figure, to an extent that we haven't realized. We've got his influence on Jesus of Nazareth. We've got his influence on the Mandaeans and on Gnosticism. And if there's interest, I will come back to and talk more about his influence on Gnosticism. One other thing is that we have this series of figures with whom Jesus and sometimes also John are compared, mentioned by the Jewish historian Josephus, that are sometimes lumped under the heading of sign prophets. And Josephus says that they created the atmosphere that led to the Jewish war against Rome. They were nonviolent figures, but he says they've got as much blood on their hands because they're contributing to this apocalyptic fervor that also inspires the revolutionaries and the people who resort to violence. And each of them goes and does something, gathers people in some place and says there will be a sign. And Jesus, in connection with that action in the temple, according to the Gospel of John, said that there would be a sign of the temple being destroyed and rebuilt. And so it's natural that historians and scholars of religion have asked, what's the connection here? And surprisingly, most historians have been happy to say, well, it must have been the spirit of the age or something like that. But these figures are so similar, each one trying to conform to some type in the Jewish scriptures and expecting a sign and gathering things. And so I think what we need to do is explain it in terms of John the Baptist and his influence. And that he spoke of one who is to come, one who would emerge from among those who come after him, his followers, who would be stronger than him and who would act in a powerful way. And after the crucifixion of Jesus, there were lots of people whose reaction, there were some people who continued to believe that he was the one. But you're probably aware, and could probably deduce, even if you weren't, that some people were like, yeah, so I guess it wasn't him. So then who is it? And so it's not surprising that we have other figures trying to step into the same model, the same role, thinking, well, then maybe it's me. And so John the Baptist's influence on Judaism, on the history that leads to the destruction of the temple, all of this has been underexplored historically. So I've done work on John and Gnosticism, but I want to leave some time for questions. And so why don't I just skip to my... By the time I skip to slides, I'll just... Yeah. So the two other things I did on the sabbatical. and then I will pause and we can go back to anything that there's questions about. But I think that the Mandaeans and John the Baptist's connection with a particular group that preserved an ancient Israelite tradition can help us explain the origins of Gnosticism too. So there I think John is decisive. But one other place I spent the sabbatical, I only have one slide from there because, as you might guess, Milledgeville, Georgia, not a lot of direct connections with this particular project, but they had a visiting scholar position, and you may be shocked by this, especially if you're from Georgia and are a patriotic Georgian, but not a lot of people apply, I think, to get this. And so I think it's a little bit less competitive than some of the other ones. And they paid me to teach one course, and the rest of the time I could spend working on the book. And I chose this picture mainly because they gave me an office, and they had so much interlibrary loans that the fact that they pretty much had no books about John the Baptist in their library holdings didn't really matter. And then I was back in Durham, England for the last little bit of the sabbatical, and they have a residential research library program that encourages people to come and work with their collections, and they do have some really, really old collections, so I thought I should better put in a picture like this with the really modern stacks, just so that you know that it wasn't just working with, or even mostly working with books like that. So John's influence, right, influenced Judaism, influenced Christianity, Gnosticism, including Manichaeism, and of course, if you're familiar with it, Islam has been influenced by John, both by way of Judaism and Christianity, but also the Quran mentions the Sabians, right, who are probably the Mandaeans, right? And John the Baptist is, in fact, a prophet in that tradition. And so he's been overshadowed by his successors, but I think he really is, if we include the people that he influenced, that you may think of as more influential, and consider John's influence on them, then I really do think that he deserves the title of at least one of the most influential figures in religious history. And I thought I'd include on this last slide, this is a picture I took of an icon I saw when I was at a conference in Romania. And this little Jesus with Big John. I thought symbolically there's, that's not what the iconography is really, it's more about Jesus being baptized, but then he's got the cup, so you got to shrink him down in order to fit. But symbolically, I thought that made for a nice ending to encapsulate that overarching point. So, as I said, I skipped through a lot of things very quickly because I want to leave time for questions, but included a lot of slides on there so that we can go back to things, and if you're like, oh, no, we want you to talk more about that, I am prepared to do so. So thank you. That's as much as I'd like to say to start with, but let's see what questions there are. Or comments, or strong objections, or whatever else you've got.
I guess I have a question. So as far as we know, John didn't leave any writings of his own, correct?
No.
What can you ascertain, I guess, from the writings of others about what John thought of himself and his own ministry?
Yeah.
We obviously have what the Gospels say. The followers of Jesus said that John believed about himself and the position of Jesus to come, but what can you say about that?
Yes, and it's just as it's hard for those of you who've read anything on the historical figure of Jesus, it's hard to get back and sit, on the one hand say Christians, we're not unbiased in the way they presented Jesus, and yet on the other hand, there's sometimes been an effort to sort of pare away theological interpretation to get back to a supposedly preceding Jesus, and I'm pretty sure Jesus understood himself in a religious framework, right, and theologically we might say, and I think the same is true of John. And so I do think that he spoke of one who was going to come after him. I do think that he, by the way he dressed, styled himself as an Elijah-like figure. And Elijah was a figure who, if he's remembered for something, it's challenging the ruler and the dominant religious practices in his time. And I'm pretty sure his choice, I've sometimes compared it to cosplay, because I do stuff with sci-fi fandom and go to places like conventions and things. And some of you may have seen me give a talk about Star Trek wearing the Starfleet uniform, so you know that I take this subject very seriously. But there's a sense in which he's cosplaying Elijah, right? He's dressing like that and saying, you've got someone like that on your hands, right? And so it's not surprising that the leaders were concerned with him, right? And he's somebody who I think, because if the stories about his priestly upbringing and background are correct, even though he ends up working against his father's own sort of connection with the priesthood, at least as far as we can tell, he probably was reasonably well educated, right? And so he was somebody that taught. And then the fact that we have these diverse offshoots, I really do think that even though he comes across as somebody who's like dogmatic and uncompromising, he must, rather like Jesus, we're told he attracted tax collectors and prostitutes and people like that. And an uncompromising fire and brimstone preacher doesn't really, connect well with those people, right? And so he must have been somebody that, was a good storyteller, right? Much like we associate with, Jesus having been. And in fact, in just that little bit that we get in the Gospels, like there are puns and wordplay and there's imagery and all those kinds of things. And so I think he was somebody who gathered around himself, something that was like for this audience, I'd say a graduate seminar, but you imagine, the people meeting in coffee houses that spark revolutions, if they had coffee then, imagine what, impact you would have had, right? They didn't have that yet. So where do you gather? You gather by the river with this teacher. And so I think those are just some hints of, the kind of figure that I think we see emerging when we start to pay attention to John in his own right. And let his connection with Jesus actually also inform us about John, and not just ask, what can John tell us about Jesus?
So what kind of, like you mentioned the Qumran community a little bit earlier, and his connection that's been presented through the Dead Sea Scrolls. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I mentioned very briefly in passing that it's been suggested that John may have gone into the desert, meaning the Judean desert, and if he was there, might have ended up at this place called Qumran, where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there was a community there, thought to have been a group known as the Essenes, who produced those scrolls. And there are some things, they mention the same text from Isaiah, right? The voice crying in the wilderness that John mentioned, things like that. And so there are some similarities, and it's sometimes been suggested that John might have spent time there. In fact, if you go to Qumran, they will show you a little movie that is like life in the community reconstructed. And there's a scene where one of the people says, yeah, we heard that Herod arrested somebody named John. You don't think that could be that John that spent time with us, could it? And I was laughing out loud the first time I went to Qumran, and I see this movie, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they did that. It's a possibility, and I'm glad it's been explored. My impression is that the relationship between John and Qumran is maybe a helpful analogy is similar to Jesus and the Pharisees, right? Where there's a lot of similarities, right? Enough that people have said Jesus was a rabbi of the same tradition and part of that movement. The agreements and disagreements suggest that maybe he just talked with them and they agreed about a lot, but he wasn't part of that movement. And I think the same is true with John, right? That there are some interesting similarities, but I don't think any of them require him to have been part of this movement. And what the Qumran group really wanted was to get back to the temple. The only reason they weren't worshiping there was because there were these priests there who just would not listen to them and do things the right way.
Well, they
right?
totally thought that those guys were reprobates. They felt like they had it going on, they had it figured out, and the guys presenting the stuff in the temple, which we find out we were, actually, we're out to lunch. Jesus came basically saying, oh, you guys are out, I'm the new sheriff's in town, you guys are going to be out on jobs soon. So, the Qumran community and the stuff that they were talking about is echoed by John and Jesus, I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, it is fascinating, yeah. I think I think they would have had a lot of interesting things to talk about. I think in the end, I don't get the sense John would have fit in there and the feeling would have been mutual. So, let's see. A fight, you had your hand.
James, I was wondering, is there any evidence of the discussion of the role of John during, for example, the Council of Nicaea and/or in non-canonical books that were not chosen? Is there any evidence we have of any discussion during that period of time?
Yes. So there's this interesting exploration of John in the Eastern Church. There's much more of a recognition that this is you have sort of Jesus and Mary and John often, when you see like the heavenly scene, who are the prominent figures there. And so there's much less effort to sort of downplay his significance. It's like, as long as you get that Jesus is greater, we don't mind that he is great. Right? And one of the things I didn't talk about is the fact that if you ask Jesus, who's the greatest human being who ever lived, greatest among those born of women? Jesus actually answered that question, and his answer was John the Baptist. They didn't really talk about John. He was not ever a candidate, I think, within developing what became Christianity to be understood as anything other than a precursor, however important, to Jesus, who is supposed to be the focus. I think a lot of that, though, and a lot of the portrait of Jesus that becomes orthodoxy emerges, at least in part, out of probably a century or so of debates with those who followed John the Baptist who didn't become Christians. Right? The Gospel of John, right, starts with this prologue that's about the Word. In the beginning was the Word, and then the Word became flesh, and it's about Jesus. But the first human being mentioned in the Gospel of John is John the Baptist. Right? And when we don't have two sides in an ancient conversation, we often find that if we read one and see what it's emphasizing, it's fairly safe guess that somebody was emphasizing the opposite, like across the aisle. And so what does the prologue of John say? It's like, John came, he was not the light, right? He came to bear witness to the light. The true light, so it's very emphatic in a way that suggests that there were people who were making the opposite claim, right? So, who were supporters of John, who were not persuaded that Jesus was, in fact, the one who was to come. So I think by that point we're already past that phase of the discussion, but it influences what becomes Christian orthodoxy, very much so.
Those,
First of all, apologies.
that's right. Those Ghanaian scrolls that we were looking at, what languages did you say we were seeing there?
Right, and so that is a dialect of Aramaic. They have their own alphabet that they use. And what's interesting is that it's only used for Mandaean sacred texts and like magical amulets and bowls and things like that. And so that makes me think, while it could be that just all secular usage of this alphabet was lost, I think it's more likely that this was an esoteric group, right, within an Aramaic-speaking community, maybe a predominantly Jewish Aramaic-speaking community, that had a sort of an esoteric tradition, right? They had a kind of a secret religion. The Mandaeans, I think, actually do give us a key to answering the long-standing question, where does Gnosticism come from, right? For those of you who are familiar with it, it's an ancient tradition that, what's most distinctive about it is that the creator of the material world and the ruler of the material world, or the material world coming into existence was a huge mistake, right? And this is essentially their answer to the question, why do bad things happen to good people? And even worse, why do good things happen to bad people, right? The material world is just a result of, there's these offshoots, right? You get these emanations from the supreme divine reality, and eventually you get far enough away that something goes amiss. And consistently, either the creator figure or the figure that is not even directly the creator but rules over this world is essentially the creator deity from Genesis. And the question that's often puzzled scholars of religion, and particularly of Gnosticism, how do you care enough about these texts to do this strange subversive interpretation? If you're not connected with Judaism, then why would you even pay attention to these texts? And if you are connected with Judaism, you're supposed to like this God, right? And so this is not where you're supposed to, And we get in the Mandaean tradition some of these celestial beings, right? Because it's preserved in a dialect of Aramaic, we actually get these Semitic names that are lost in like the Coptic Gnostic sources and other languages. And they have names that reflect pre-exilic Israelite religion, right? So you get Yoruba, which seems to be like Yah, Yoruba, right? So Yahweh the Great, Yahweh of Heaven, Anat He, right? Anat of life, where we have Anat Yahu and Anat Baal in ancient Israel and Canaan. And so what I think happened was that at some point John intersected with some of these pockets of rural communities where you still had holdouts that did not accept this monotheistic revolution that had happened after the exile. And the intersection of what he was emphasizing and what they were bringing with them somehow led to this mystical thing that brings together baptism and religious experience and the subversive way of interpreting the Jewish scripture. And so there's some really fascinating stuff in there. And so precisely because this is Gnostic tradition in a different linguistic environment and one that's may bring us closer to its roots, there's some really interesting stuff in there that I've probably just confused you about rather than summarized it very well in what I just said. But if any of that sounds even slightly interesting, I'll buy you coffee and tell you more about it sometime. Or you can ask follow-up questions now.
I love the insight that you came up with, that here John is baptizing in the Jordan, and he's offering something outside of the tradition of this is how we do it here. The temple, and he's outside of that way, and that puts him at odds with them. In a way.
And I think that's the way we need to understand it. Yeah. So I was expecting as I said, I was expecting the Greek to be more legible because I'm a latecomer to Aramaic, but precisely because it's not a living language and was not something that was copied a lot and written a lot except for these specific purposes, it's very much sort of like block script and very it's, the writing is usually right. Even when you have, I had some manuscripts that had some, So even when the handwriting is not great, and this one's sideways, just, and it's sort of a bit blotchy, it's still fairly legible, right? Whereas if you look at this Greek text, I don't know how many of you know Greek, but for those of you who have been part of some Greek house or other and know the alphabet, right? That's what New Testament people read. It's like written in those block letters, right? That's what you do. This, like. I'd rather go back to this. It's like, it is 1:30, and so I don't know. There may be people who need to go, and I do want to say that you can if you need to. If anyone has any further questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you.